Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 10th IFAD Innovation Talk. Before we start today, I would like to remind you that today's event is being recorded. By joining the event, you are agreeing to the recording taking place and for it to be shared on our platforms. As usual, I would like to invite you to visit our event page to check the speaker profiles, the event's concept note and agenda, which is being shared with you in the chat box. Welcome to today's event. Despite the accelerated need to digitize, which is the process of transforming information from a physical format to a digital version, in many instances, due to security issues or lack of focus on modernization, information and negotiations still happen through massive paperwork or email trails. The pandemic has made these problems even more evident, and the need to better utilize technology to enhance corporate processes more pressing. Indeed, the increased need for digitalization prompted by the pandemic has resulted in accelerated digital transformation, which has brought many benefits, but also risks as organizations become more vulnerable to fraud and hacking attacks. Therefore, organizations must focus on finding solutions that mitigate risks through the use of new digital technologies and a change in the way they do business. One of these ways is introducing digital signatures. Today's session of the IFAD Innovation Talks will feature a fireside chat between Advit Nath, Controller and Director of IFAD's Financial Controllers Division, and Hélène Papper, Director of IFAD's Global Communications and Advocacy Division, who will deep dive into IFAD's basic electronic and secure digital signatures, and will talk about how innovations can make corporate procedures more efficient and agile while also ensuring the adequate level of security. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Hélène Papper is the Director of IFAD's Global Communications and Advocacy Division, which is responsible for IFAD's global, internal, and external communication strategies and operations. Before joining IFAD, Hélène was the Director of the United Nations Information Center for Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, based in Bogota. Hélène has led strong advocacy programs in the fields of gender, climate, environment, social inclusion, and education aligned with the UN 2030 agenda. Hélène holds a Master of Advanced Studies in Literature and Civilization from the Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris, France, and 2 bachelor's degrees in Broadcast Journalism and Political Science from Syracuse University in New York. Advit Nath is Controller and Director of IFAD's Financial Controllers Division. Advit is a Canadian national with over 24 years of progressive leadership experience in international finance and development. He has worked in 5 continents in the private sector, government, academia, and in international organizations. Advit holds a master's degree in human rights law, is a Canadian chartered accountant, a chartered professional accountant, and has a postgraduate education in development law and international dispute resolution from the University of London. To get us started, I'm going to pass the floor to Hélène, who will kick us off with an introduction on today's topic, digital signatures, financial crime protection, and blockchain at IFAD. Take it away, Hélène.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this really interesting space that we are looking into right now. It's something that I'm quite passionate about personally because we are in a very crowded and busy space in the humanitarian and development nexus. And the world is facing major challenges, from the consequences of the climate catastrophe to health pandemics to consequences of ongoing conflicts, and how this is affecting our food systems right now, our overall ambition to meet our 2030 agenda and sustainable development goals, reducing poverty, famine, increasing access to health, education, curbing conflict. But shock after shock, it's making it more and more difficult to move forward on those objectives. And the need to both meet nascent humanitarian needs as well as rapidly scale up long-term development efforts are absolutely fundamental. And so there is an increased need to have funding to be able to support the world moving forward, to support the communities often left behind in participating in a circular economy that is going to move us forward on this long-term sustainability track. We have a global GDP of $100 trillion, $100 trillion. And so funding is out there. But unfortunately, as a UN report just recently said and showcased, bribery and corruption account for 3.6 trillion per year. Meanwhile, we have a development aid system that has $2 trillion a year. And the call from stakeholders and donors, and of course, taxpayers themselves, to increase transparency reporting in face with those numbers that we are now hearing in terms of the amount of bribery and corruption is rising. We have to be part of those who reassure that money goes from donor to development, to donor to the people who need it the most, with as little loss as possible to fraud. And of course, that demand is increasing in the face of recent scandals that have come about. And this is where it gets really interesting today. You know, I've spent most of my life in the field, across Africa, across Asia, across the Middle East and Latin America most recently, and spent a lot of time working with those populations most in need, and witnessed myself the fact that when people were waiting for funding to be able to develop programs that would help them live better, time and time again, we've seen funding go through losses. That is, you know, that is lost before it gets to the people that need it the most. But new technology and what we now refer to increasingly as AI for good, that's artificial intelligence for good, is giving us an incredible opportunity to track funding in a much more efficient way, increasing even further our transparency and credibility. And as a fund here, specialized in rural development, here at IFAD, we've been working really hard to integrate this technology and to make sure that we are using it to show the way in terms of how we can report, how we can be credible, and how we can track money, in essence, from donor to farm. And so Advit here and I, we've been discussing for quite a while all of the work that he's been doing in this space, which is really interesting in terms of showing the way forward. So tell us a little bit, Advit, as well from your perspective. How can new technology be used to respond to this growing concern and to improve transparency, traceability of funds, and reduce corruption that we're obviously seeing a lot more reported, thanks to the capacity to be able to assess it?
Well, thank you, Helen and Dana. It's really a pleasure to be here and to speak to you about these critical issues that you mentioned, Helen. Not only because our beneficiaries really need to get as much funding to them as possible to improve their lives and live with dignity, but also to give confidence to our donors that we are leveraging the best technology that's out there. And we are living in a very interesting, exciting time where we're at the cusp of moving to new technologies that can change and reimagine how development aid works. And I'm very proud to say that IFAD is taking a lead role in some of these areas. And we really want to learn and grow and try and find ways to use technology in ways to help the poorest, which is our main objective. So just to let me give you a little context that I fully agree we're living in a very complex world, and we work in very complicated scenarios. We work in fragile and conflict countries, and that's our raison d'etre. That's why IFAD exists, to support the poorest wherever they are. So we do need solutions to support these complicated problems, because also donors, as you mentioned, Helen, will take their money to the entities that will ensure money goes to the right place. And there's this saying that donors will vote with their feet, which means that they'll just move their money to more transparent organizations and organizations who can prove that every dollar went to where it was intended to go. Now, international financial institutions like IFAD and the UN agencies have extensive mechanisms in place currently. We can say in significant terms that the money does go to places intended. However, can we definitively say that every dollar, 100% of every dollar goes to exactly where it should go? And we can say a lot, but we can't say 100% with today's technology. Now, given that we're on this cusp of the new technologies I was referring to, they're called Web3. And what's interesting about this new word Web3 is that it removes the middle person, the the social media sites, the search engines, and allows connectivity directly to beneficiaries, directly to each other. So it's going to be a very new decentralized web as we move more towards this technology and see how we use it. One of these technologies within Web3 is called blockchain technology, which is just a digital ledger. It's nothing more complicated than a digital ledger that securely stores data from many sources in one golden source. It's unhackable. And I know some of you will ask the question, is it the same as cryptocurrencies, which just lost $2 trillion on the markets? And I will very firmly say that it is a no. It is very different than cryptocurrency. Blockchain is a technology that is essentially a digital ledger to record transactions securely and transparently. So that's a short introduction. Now let's come to IFAD. Did we solve the problem that you mentioned about tracing the dollar through these new technologies? Well, I can say we're getting there. We have this solution that we call Trace Blockchain or Digital Ledger by IFAD. We were able to trace funds from donor to farmer fully through this technology. We tested our solution in one of our projects in Kenya. It's a $100 million project on climate resilience for agricultural practices for smallholder farmers. And we were successful to show where the money came from, every single actor it went to, and then where it ended up, which was with the farmer. And all those transactions within that ecosystem were placed on this digital ledger. We also received some global recognition for this work. And again, it's still at the early stages, but we were written up in an annual report of a global blockchain publication, in IFAD being the first in the world to use blockchain in this way for development. I've also spoken at a few global blockchain conventions about IFAD's project, including 3 weeks ago at the European Blockchain Convention, where there were many startups, and they loved the idea and our story and how we work and who we work for. Let me tell you what we did. So the current technologies, such as ERP systems or enterprise resource planning systems, have limitations. That's what we all have currently. All companies in the world have these ERP systems. IFAD has one of the top ERP systems in the world. However, it has limitations. What are those limitations? Basically, if we receive money from a donor, let's say from Canada, and then we disperse that money to a partner, let's say the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya, we can trace the money from the donor, from Canada, to IFAD, from IFAD to Kenya, the government. But it stops there. Then we manually manage the other softwares, through other softwares, the various other checks and controls, which we have many, and through project supervision missions, project audits, among others. But these are separate systems, and they don't all talk to each other. That requires manual intervention. Now, this limitation is also limiting us how we use data. It's not in one place. It's not real time. It's not transparent, and no one else can see it. So we need to connect the dots. To your point, Helen, that we need to connect the dots and use data efficiently to make better decisions. So with the digital ledger solution in our Kenya project, we were able to trace funds and found that there were 50, and that's 50 actors between the donor and the farmer. We didn't realize that, in full honesty. We thought there was a lot less. But when you put this on a transparent digital ledger, you see the entire traceability of the funds. Now, how does it work? Each of the actors would be connected to the digital ledger. So the donors would connect their ERP system to the digital ledger through a very low-cost API. It's basically a connector, so two systems can talk. IFAD would connect ours in the same way. Farmers have a mobile phone app, an application that we created. So they can just go on their mobile phones, which pretty much all of them have, and be able to be connected to the digital ledger. Vendors can go to a secure website or a phone and also connect to the digital ledger. And it's a fraction of the cost of implementing an ERP system as well, because that's the beauty of the decentralized model. And one goal was traceability, which we achieved. A second goal of this project was to ensure all the 50 actors I spoke about in the Kenya project don't have issues with fraud, money laundering, terrorism financing, sanctions, and related risks, which goes to your question, Helen. How do we know the money goes to the right place? So we tested it in this project using digital ledger technology. And we sent the entire group of 50 actors into our anti-money laundering software, and they were all clean. So we achieved the second goal of compliance to ensure that we know and can prove where the money went and to whom. Now we're very excited to take this to the next level. And hopefully, if things go well in stage 2, we will look to scaling this solution to every IFAD project and ensure full traceability from donor to farmer. We also ensure, just so everyone knows, that personal data privacy is extremely important to IFAD. We are on the gold standard of data privacy, and we will ensure no personal information of farmers or our beneficiaries would ever be made available on a public format. So for that reason, we've also opted for a private permissioned digital ledger on the Ethereum digital ledger, meaning that only those actors we know will be allowed to join. In the future, we can move towards a more public model, and that reduces costs. And you can do that very securely as well by keeping private information off-chain and only necessary information on-chain. My last thought is to reimagine development aid if this solution or something similar to it is applied to every IFAD project, but also every project in the $2 trillion a year development aid that you spoke about, Helen. It would revolutionize development aid, and perhaps more funds would come into development that could be used for beneficiaries.
It's quite fascinating, and actually, I'm really glad you mentioned the linkage between this work that is moving forward in data governance, right? And a lot of discussions that are taking place as we move into using artificial intelligence. There are obviously a lot of ethical considerations that are taking place, and a lot of actors that are examining that, right? When we start gathering data through these types of digital technologies, how do we make sure that it is protected and that that data is not used for other types of then inefficient or corrupt or criminal activity? And at the same time, there is a lot of work that is being done to make sure that we stay on the same track, on that track, and on a very regularized track when it comes to that. And so I think it's really good that you mention it. You also mentioned briefly, and maybe you could sum it up quickly, another of the technologies that is being developed within this realm in terms of anti-money laundering, a specific software that IFAD has access to and has been developing in terms of anti-money laundering. So how does IFAD use the solution today to protect donor and taxpayer funds from the risks mentioned earlier? And tell us a little bit about how that works. And also, taking into consideration all of the challenges and the questions around data privacy.
Yeah, that's a very important question, Helen, and it's becoming much more important in the world today, which has become much more remote, much more online, and nefarious actors are taking advantage of that remote sort of ability to go online and cause havoc in different ways. So financial crime is something that refers to money laundering, terrorism financing, sanctions, tax evasion, fraud and corruption, and cyber attacks. And these are very much on the rise. There's a global watchdog organization in financial crime called FATF, and their statistics are that this is skyrocketing, and we have to protect ourselves and manage that risk. You may have heard about a recent case of the Costa Rican government for over the last 2 months have essentially been crippled by ransomware and a cyber attack that has affected 27 ministries. Bad actors have breached firewalls and disabled systems, and now it's affecting tax payments and medical appointments as well. So the loss of funds is really one of those things we have to ensure as a publicly accountable organization with taxpayer money in a large part to protect that money. Another example was in October 2021, there was these Pandora Papers that were released by a journalism organization, and there was 11 million secret documents that were published about the hidden wealth of rich individuals and companies. And at the time, just because we had this system in place, this money laundering system I'll tell you about, anti-money laundering system, we were able to search that database against our database of master files and ensure that no individuals or entities that were in those papers where there was evidence of problems are in our master files. So we don't do business with entities that could be problematic as well. And now beyond these examples, IFAD the question is, can IFAD definitively say we're working with clean partners? And because of this software that I'll tell you a little bit about shortly, we can say by and large, yes. And I'll tell you how. So we started with a policy on anti-money laundering. We were the first UN agency, except for the World Bank, that created a policy on anti-money laundering. We had great engagement from our governing bodies, and that policy was approved by our board in 2019. We benchmarked it against 13 banks and international financial institutions, and we developed some innovative procedures that were also looked at by a law firm that helped us develop one of the best procedures also in the industry, as we've heard from some of our peers when we presented our solution and some of the procedures as well. So we use a software by LexisNexis. It has 2 billion entries in its databases. It screens every day against 20,000 entries in our vendor, partner, and staff master files. And so if an entity, let's say today is clean, but tomorrow gets onto a sanctions list, our software will pick it up first thing in the morning, and we'll know that that entity is a problem, and it will immediately raise the flag and block. So we were able to implement this software very quickly in under 2 months at a relatively low cost. And what's really nice about how we've decided to leverage this technology is we have decided, and we're the first in the international financial institutions as well, to decentralize the software to all 700 staff in IFAD globally. And we've trained the staff. So anyone in any country globally in an IFAD location can jump onto the software within under 10 seconds, can put in the name of an individual, consultant, vendor, supplier, a partner, and they can see search the 2 billion entries to see if there's any problems with those entities. If there is, they can escalate it directly to my financial crime team, who will look at the item and consult and discuss on it. So that's the advantage of having this software available to everyone globally. It just protects IFAD and protects donor money and taxpayer money as well. We've also connected our system to our core banking platform, which is our internet banking platform that we use 24/7. And what's nice about that is the visibility of downstream partners, which we've never had before, is now directly fed into our anti-money laundering system through our client portal. The scope is broad. All money coming into IFAD and going out of IFAD is checked. We also have very strict procedures on a positive match. Our specialist reviews it. If it's a true match, we immediately deactivate the vendor or individual, and no payments can be made from IFAD. We also have an escalation model, a red, orange, yellow, green model, where there's a strong governance where these items that are more risky go to our risk committees and our governing bodies also for information. We also have a law firm on retainer if we ever need to do deep dives, and we've done that a month ago with specific cases when you need localized information. Yeah, I think this software has been very useful. However, if we can now, thinking back to the earlier question, if we can somehow leverage digital ledger technology and connect our anti-money laundering system directly rather than to existing core banking systems, existing ERP systems, then you really see the power of what you were referring to as well, Helen, about the use of AI and other analytical tools that can go to the one source and start doing an analysis as well.
That's really really remarkable, and at the same time, I think it opens the door to quite another world of possibilities, because we've been talking about how digital ledger, blockchain can be used to trace the funds, right, and to increase that credibility and that transparency when it comes to moving funds from donor to farm. And at the same time, as we were discussing earlier, you said that the very same technology or very similar technology can also be used at a much broader level to also gather data and information to be able to be closer to the people that we serve. And that's something that, you know, I've been working on for years across the humanitarian development space, when the work that I was leading had to do with increasing the capacity for social dialogue to inform on policy decisions and to inform on better decision making overall at multilateral levels, with that clear necessity to be able to engage the people we work with. And it started, you know, years ago, we started doing this with mobile technology, with surveys and doing contracts and starting to look at the kind of technology we could use to gather inputs and voices directly from the different populations that we worked with, to support democratization processes, to support peace agreements that were being negotiated, and to make sure that voices of populations often left behind were part of that mix. And so we did a little bit ad hoc, right, with technology, with mobile companies in South Sudan, in Mali, in the Congo, in RDC Congo, and using radio. But now we have technology that is improved to the point that we can actually do this more systematically. We've been talking about how to do that, right? We have this amazing opportunity to use that very similar technology. And there is the capacity to now capture data and voices and solutions directly from the populations we serve at a much broader scale. Turn that into data, both qualitative and quantitative data, that can then feed into the policy and decision making that we were doing a little bit ad hoc through mobile phone companies. But now with the technology that you've talked about, we are also integrating within our capacity to drive information for decision making in a much more credible way. In the multilateral world, IFIs, UN, development, humanitarian actors at large, there is a recognition that while we have made significant progress in the 20th century in fostering spaces for international diplomacy, encouraging discussions across the globe among decision makers and leaders on global challenges, the reason we're yet far from seeing more sustainable effects is that we've missed that key element, which is our capacity to listen and take into consideration the populations themselves at a much more realistic and global scale. Local realities and needs. We saw this with the UN 75 years into the lifespan of the UN. The main call was to go back to local solutions. But how do we actually do that? A lot of people are saying this now. Global leaders are saying this, going back to local solutions, local realities, and it's advocacy. But how do we move from advocacy to reality? And with this AI, we can do this now. Last year, as an example, here at IFAD, we developed a model with Farm Radio International to engage our rural populations and farmers directly through radio across 4 countries of operations. This was just as a scale-up model. And programs that they themselves participated in directly to speak to some key issues that concern them most in their daily lives, in terms of their necessity to strengthen their resilience to shock. What are some of their key issues that they're dealing with when it comes to climate, when it comes to developing their rural agriculture further, when it comes to being able to produce nutritious elements, nutritious food supplies, so that they strengthen themselves when it comes to health and to their capacity to then use that to strengthen communities around them and feed their nations and feed the world, in fact. And thanks to artificial intelligence, we were able to capture those tens of thousands of voices and turn them into relevant qualitative and quantitative data that fed into the Food Systems Summit directly. And so this is yet another way to enhance transparency and credibility of decision making. And if we do this at a more systematic level, and we use what you were mentioning earlier, Advit, that capacity to showcase that the data and the algorithms used to be able to capture those voices is actually reflective of what the populations need themselves, it's going to enable us to be a lot more true to the programs that we fund and make sure that the projects and programs that are developed or that are funded and the solutions that are leveraged throughout are actually much closer to responding to local population needs, and therefore have a lifespan that is much longer term than solutions that are not in correspondence to what people are living for on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that that's really interesting to see how the two meet. And so as we move forward, we have the capacity to then track the funds directly to the farmers themselves, but also use their local knowledge and local realities and take that information back to make sure that then the funding that is going to them serves their purpose. So I think it's quite a beautiful circle that we're looking at.
I love that example because you were able to collect data directly from the farmers and that's 100,000, that's a big number, meaning how do you manually put that information together? Well, it'll take probably months. So you were able to use artificial intelligence to cipher through all those responses and then come up with the relevant responses and summarize that information probably very quickly. And that way you are able to feed that information through analytics and better data decision-making into the Food System Summit. I mean, that's the next sort of important area that we need to move from traceability, as you said. We've got compliance, and then now let's look at development results. I mean, I think that is actually probably the most important element of the digital ledger blockchain solution we would like to get to in our next stage. So while we can check the box on traceability, so we can trace. We have the compliance. We know it's gone through our anti-money laundering system. Now you have farmers who have their mobile phones who can connect directly to the digital ledger. We could now do surveys with them on a near real-time basis. We can ask them, has IFAD's project in this particular location been gender transformative? Has it achieved SDG 2 on zero hunger? Has it? And we can put that kind of direct feedback from beneficiaries in very near real time to our system, our digital ledger, and then from there put a layer of AI, potentially artificial intelligence, and analyze the data and use it for better decision making. So I really like that example, and I think that is really the next stage for where we would like to take also the project that IFAD is working on. To be able to just be more effective for beneficiaries.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is that additionally to those surveys that are helpful, we have the capacity to use this in engaging dialogue and making sure that we respect the dignification of the populations that we serve through this dialogue with people that they trust, right? And what we saw through the results of this work across those 4 countries was that because we had been able to work through leaders in the communities as well as on-air systems with radio stations, people that they know and that they trust, they were able to engage in discussions that were a lot broader than just answering questions, but that really engaged and allowed them to talk about how they are living the future, how they are living their lives day to day, what their ambitions are. And so some of the results we got really showcased the fact that at an international level, there are some perceptions that are not necessarily what the reality is on the field. The fact that we have the youth saying, we don't actually want to move to cities. We want to continue working in rural areas, but we need better inputs. We need more agile financial mechanisms to be able to develop. We need to make sure that what we are receiving is going to enable us to grow nutritious foods, and that we need to know where, we need to have that access to that transparency so that we know that we're not going to make our communities sick as we move into different kinds of agricultural practices. And so all of this came through these dialogues, and we're able to capture that. So it's really interesting to be able to move forward on this. In the end, what we're talking about here, and I think Advit, you'd agree with me, is that as we develop these types of practices, whether it helps us reduce bribery, fraud, corruption, or whether it helps us also engage, or at the same time, engage populations to make sure that the programs we fund are more efficient, we are creating efficiencies all the way. Because as we create credibility within these new digital technologies and this AI for good, we're able to also reduce some of the bells and whistles we've had all along to support the populations and to try to avoid, other types of fraud and corruption. But that costs, right? You were talking about, the different layers of whistles and bells that you've had to have to make sure that we could trace funds as quickly, as more efficiently as possible. But with this technology, we're going to be able to little by little remove those additional layers. And so that's going to create efficiencies and cost, and therefore gains in terms of our funding going to the farmers and the populations, correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, that the efficiency side of things. So we've talked a bit about the compliance, traceability, some of the data analytics and decision making, but the efficiency side is actually a very big one as well. The layers of controls we have now is quite enormous, and we need to streamline and reduce these quite dramatically. And we can, if you use a technology that requires you to use one technology to get you onto digital ledger rather than 5 in the current existing world, you get rid of the 5 and just move to the 1. And that means you have a lot easier ways of also our clients and our beneficiaries have an easier way to communicate with us as well. So on the digital ledger technology, one of the advantages is this concept called smart contracts. And all that means is it's a computer program that can execute based on some logic. So let's say we have a farmer sitting in Mozambique on a farm. They can, on their mobile phone, they would have received the tractor or the seeds. They would go onto their mobile phone, immediately press the button, say, I received the seeds or tractor to good quality, and a smart contract, and that goes to the blockchain, digital ledger, and a smart contract would execute to say, make payment to the vendor. And that vendor gets paid almost immediately. And that means instead of 30, 60, 90 days to wait for a payment, the payment is efficient. We don't have to run paper, run invoices, send that over through DHL. That's cost and time. And that can all be eliminated through this concept as well that we're also building on in terms of our IFAD project on Trace. So that's one way on the digital ledger. Another way is through digital signatures we talked about very briefly earlier. We implemented a digital signature solution. It's through DocuSign. It's used by many. It's over 250,000, I think, banks, governments, entities use them. But what's interesting is having implemented that mainly because of the COVID pandemic and during the lockdowns when the mailing systems had stopped and we had to recognize how do we get some of the paper that was coming from projects and also some of the electronic information. Well, we moved to this new platform, and as of today, we have 17 pages a day that are being digitally signed securely through this technology. And the digital signatures essentially, it essentially ensures that the person behind who they say they are is actually the person. And it's an encrypted way of signing a document digitally. And so it's been very useful as another tool to use. In fact, just recently I normally sign these physical letters to ministers of finance and agriculture. There's 90 letters that go out every year to validate the authorized users to our core banking system. Well, we went through DocuSign and we sent that all digitally. And that means that everything was not on paper. It was immediate. It's environmentally friendly. It saves time. So we are really encouraging every piece of paper that comes to IFAD. We are digitizing it in a way that goes through these new technologies. And as you said, that means that farmers don't have to worry about the inefficiencies of process as well, and more and the speed of processes and the speed that the money gets to them is quicker, so they can do the necessary work to feed the growing population of the world.
It's really interesting also is that there's a lot of commonality in the end with what you just mentioned and the work that we're also trying to speed forward in terms of disinformation, misinformation, and that technology that is being used for this. In the end, when we talk about corruption and money laundering, it is also very much linked to being able to trace the reality, right? to trace what is real behind it and the users. And the same with information, disinformation, misinformation, which is the, underspoken about or pandemic of today, and how it's impacting our capacity to do our work in a transparent way, and how it's impacting our populations, how it is creating the possibility for new conflicts that are arising across the globe. And the technology that is pervasive right now in terms of fake news and deep fakes. And there's just been discussions on using the technology that you've just been talking about to be able to counter this deep fake, right? To have digital signatures, a digital footprint in some ways, to be able to say, this is actually me, this is not a deep fake, or this information does come from credible sources and not from forces that have been manufactured, or information that has not been verified. So I think it's really interesting to see how those two are going to be developing hand in hand in many ways, right? Technology is going to further our capacity to trust the funding mechanisms, at the same time trusting the information sources, and supporting populations from having dialogues that are going to enable us to strengthen sustainable development in a credible way. So I think this is extremely interesting. And at the same time, I think we have just a little bit more time to touch upon something that we haven't really looked into, and that is something that is being developed in terms of other exciting new technologies. When we hear about DeFi and Web3 and DAOs, but also the metaverse. Metaverse is definitely something, again, a space of commonality where there's a lot of discussion. And how is metaverse going to be used in a positive way to protect information gathering, to serve populations most at need? And it sounds a little bit out of this world, right? But how is that evolving in your space as well?
Yeah, thanks, Helen, for those great questions. So yeah, I think the Web3 and DeFi, which is just a word for decentralized finance, means that we're going to all be connected to each other. We will be able to connect quickly. We will not have someone take our data and commercialize it and use it for advertising or misinformation. And I think you still have the problems of mis and disinformation, because there's people out there and they're going to communicate. So these platforms we also have to find some level of, whether the word is regulation or protections, to avoid those serious sort of breaches of disinformation. But what it can do is empower. It can bring everyone to the table. Right now, you have to have you have to meet certain criteria to be able to get onto some platforms. You have to provide your picture, your fingerprints, your face. So this is not supporting privacy, individual privacy, because we know information can be misused, and people are very suspicious about, particularly in different parts, given we have a wide globe. So I do believe that it will still be, and if entities like IFAD can use these platforms for the good, for development, there's a lot of applications for private sector use and to make more money. But if we can use these platforms for good, I think we can really make a difference. The concept of DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, this is very interesting, because it is about running a company through voting. So every decision made is essentially voted on, and by the community. So imagine farmers being set up a DAO by IFAD. These farmers have a company that they make decisions on. So they are a shareholder in the decision making. That's quite big, and very good for empowerment, particularly for women farmers and some of the targeted groups that we are trying to advance. And I'll just say one last thing before. I know there's some questions that we wanted to get to. Dana's there telling me that. So the metaverse, I think we will all spend a little time in the metaverse. Potentially, can we use the metaverse in a way that showcases, communicates what IFAD does? And I think if we can do that, we can find a way to get to youth. We can find a way to communicate all the great work we're doing in different platforms, and also, of course, communicate with each other physically through Zoom, and of course through the metaverse in the near future.
Thank you so much. So I just want to say for everyone watching, thank you, Hélène and Advit, for this really interesting fireside chat. I appreciate, and I think viewers will too, that you went beyond the technology and innovations and really related these to our real life beneficiaries and how that happens in real time. And on that note, the first question that we have, which is from Colombia, is a question for Advit. Fraud and crime are more of a human behavior. How does IFAD plan to work with governments so that you have the full potential of this technology achievable? And could you share what that means for our beneficiaries?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's important when we implement technologies that it's not done in isolation, and it's not IFAD pushing a technology down onto governments or beneficiaries, because we are partners in development. And if you don't have your partner working with you closely, you won't understand. IFAD will not understand what the problems are, what the issues are, and how to find the right solutions. And in the end of the day, it's about finding the right solution, finding the technology to solve the problem, and what that solution is. It may be digital ledger technology in one case, it may not be, it may be something else in another case. So we're not trying to take a technology and fit it to the problem, we're trying to really see what's the best technology for that problem. So in terms of the point about financial crime and fraud, which is about human behavior, that's exactly one of the complexities of it, that fraud is intentional. It's always an intent to defraud, to gain, and financial crime is to find ways to hide what is also not correctly done. Money that's been received but laundered, meaning try to make it clean and make it look clean, and then buy something that's legitimate with that now clean money. So we do. Our key strategy is to work with our governments and our partners, NGOs, as well. So we include the partners in all our discussions before we make decisions on solutions. That's really a very key element. We understand that we have over 50 country offices. We have our countries and our regional directors and our country directors who understand a lot of the issues. So we talk, of course, to our IFAD colleagues first, and then of course to the beneficiaries, to really try and mitigate and minimize. And it's a way we need to do that, because many of our databases also don't cover all the parts of the world. So we need intelligence, we need to communicate, we need to share information. We actually do a lot of technical capacity building at the government level. That's sharing information, exchanging information. The software I mentioned in financial crime, which is decentralized. So while our IFAD staff have access and are licensed to use it, when there's a procurement that a government entity does, we can run the entities through our software. That's how we help the governments work together with others as well. So I think through all the technologies, digital signatures, we communicated with the 90 governments before we sent the information, and we found through UNDP and other partners, we communicate with them, we exchange, we agreed, and now we're sending all our requests for UNDP in several countries, and we're going to expand that through DocuSign, through digital signatures, because it's more secure, and both parties see the efficiencies as well on that.
Thanks, Advit. I think that's really interesting. And you talk about the partnerships and the connection to our beneficiaries. To take it a step further, we have another question in the chat. Are those technologies easily accepted, or do you feel like there's a resistance? And I want to bring Hélène into this too and give her a chance to speak from the field perspective of what is it like when you're presented with a technology like that? And is there an enthusiasm, or is there resistance, like we might wonder?
Yeah, from the field perspective, of course, when we come in with any type of new technology, new ideas, you have to make sure that there is that engagement with the populations themselves, that dialogue that happens, to make sure that they take it on board, right? It's not something that we're there, as Advit just mentioned, it's definitely not something that we're there to impose on. But when we're able to engage with them to look at some of their key needs and necessities, and a lot of that key needs and necessities always stem from one thing, which is making sure that I am heard. And I am living in this condition, in this part of the world, and this is my reality on a day-to-day basis. And I want you, the international donor, you, the stakeholder, you, the my tribal leader, or my community leader, or you, my government, or my president, or those who are making decisions around me, to hear me, to hear my reality, to understand that I have an identity that needs to be taken into the decision making, and that just the fact of knowing that that I am being listened to already is half the battle, if not 3/4 of the battle. And so then being able to say that, this technology that we're then using to be able to bring those voices, bring your voice into the mix, is therefore accepted in many ways, but there has to be that dialogue that is done. There has to be the reassurance. There has to be some type of desire from people themselves to take this on. And that absolutely is fundamental. And that doesn't happen from one day to the next, right? I think that by being able to work together and making sure that these solutions do meet what people want themselves, then I think we can move forward sustainably. But of course, it does take time. And of course, this will be adapted depending on the different realities and the different locations and the different cultures and the different habits, right? Being able to gain trust in technology, or even the use of information in populations coming out of war, such as in South Sudan, when people were just coming into the referendum for independence, being able to work with the youth and child soldiers to adapt to these new realities of information, and how information and the use of technology could bring their voices into decision-making processes. There was a lot of work to be done to build trust around that, to be able to trust that dialogue and the use of technology to then be able to influence and infer into peacekeeping processes, but also decision-making when it came to peace agreements. And so I think that's fundamental. And I think Advit probably will see the same thing when it comes to this use for financial mechanisms.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, Dana, and to the person who raised it. And just to complement what Helen said from the field perspective, we really see that if you can show people that it will benefit them in some ways, there's much more, and you're listening to them, as Helen mentioned, then you'll find that there's much quicker adoption. So for example, when vendors realize, okay, instead of getting paid in 60 days, you get paid in 1 day, would you like to do that? They'll sign on. So they'll sign on to the blockchain digital ledger quite quickly. You've just shown them that you'll help them. I think we do, as part of our strategy, especially for something that does involve beneficiaries, it's key and part of our key strategy to consult, to inform of what information is not going to be put out there and what information, limited information, is in a hashed, secure way. And that it's never going to be able to be traceable directly to them. It's not personal data. We have, as I mentioned, the gold standard of personal data protection, which is equivalent to the EU's GDPR. So we respect that. We have to respect it per our policy. So we ensure that, not only for compliance reasons, but just because we are IFAD and we care about making sure we protect farmers and the information that comes to us through our beneficiaries and through our projects as well. So giving the assurances, governments, it's going to depend, and it's true. When we look at scaling, I think we are going to see we've picked some very digitally forward countries, Kenya as a good example. So it's not very difficult to get that buy-in. But where we go to other partners, there will be a discussion. There will be potentially not have buy-in, and then what we'll do is we'll just move to the next place. And when you see enough of a mass group coming on and seeing the benefits, you'll start seeing the few stragglers and the others who haven't come online also coming online over time. So I think it will take time. It's not going to be immediate. But that's the model for anything. When we went to the current technology of having a 24/7 internet banking platform on a website, we had the same questions from our partners to say, is it secure? Should I ask for a loan through this technology? Maybe someone else will receive it and receive my information and my banking information. So we went through the communication, ensured we have full encryption, tunnels, VPNs. We have all the controls and cybersecurity controls in place. We do KYC, all the financial crime checks I mentioned, know your customer, etc. So we have to do all those things in addition to protect our beneficiaries and our partners. So there's resistance, but I think we'll get over it over time.
Great, thank you. And I think this is the last question we have time for, and it's a tag along to the previous two questions out of the UK, which is, could we talk a little bit about access to those financial products and tools for beneficiaries? So I think just thinking about inclusion, give a couple minutes, and then we're going to wrap up.
Sure. So another good question. So we have a suite of solutions and tools that we offer to our beneficiaries. And the idea again is that how do you communicate that through the new technologies and through the current means? So whether it's a loan or a grant or one of the other solutions that we offer, the idea is that we're able to communicate, maybe whether that's through the metaverse now in a new way, and we show all our products available, and you can test drive them in the metaverse, and you can see if you take a loan of X amount, what's the scenario, what's going to be the payback, that's all possible. Even maybe perhaps even more easily through the new technologies. We do have a more manual way of doing that now, and that's part of the communication and discussion. And the idea again is that we provide solutions, and they vary. Those solutions vary depending on the needs of our customer, of our beneficiaries. So I think to answer that question, we are using technology in new ways. We are using quite a few new analytical tools, new financial modeling tools. We keep upgrading and moving to newer softwares. But to get to use Web3 and some of the new technologies that are out there, I think we're evolving and learning about that as well. I don't think it's really quite settled. So I think you've really asked a question that we're still thinking about. And as we get more answers, I hope we'll be able to share that through the various platforms.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone in the audience for their great questions, and then give time. I'm going to pass it back to Helen for final thoughts, and keeping in mind we've just got a few minutes, so 1 minute each for your final thoughts before we wrap up today.
Thanks. I'm just going to add very, very quickly to something that Advit just mentioned, is that, a lot of times when we have these discussions and we look at how digital technology is evolving, AI, there's often a reaction to say, well, yeah, but that works for a certain part of the world. But what about, the people that you serve? They're in, very remote areas of the world, these rural development and farmers and the poorest areas of the world. And there is no technology there, or there is. But actually, technology has developed to the point that even in the most remote areas, we do see it, right? We do see people using mobile technology across the world. We do have the capacity to then engage also what is there and be able to make sure that we bridge that gap and that digital gap as the world continues to evolve and making in digital aggrandizement and making sure that we're covered across the world. But there is that capacity to use it, and that is something that I think is important, that we're not just talking about specific areas of the world, but it is something that is very much growing to make sure that we are in the capacity to use it to serve the people who are often left behind. And we've said this several times, but it is extremely important, because as we move forward in this growing ambition to address global challenges, to strengthen our capacity to do it credibly, to make sure that we are engaging stakeholders, donors, but also governments in working together and across sectors and with the private sector and with innovation and technology, so that we actually come together and make sure the solutions we develop include and reach to the furthest communities across the globe. We have to understand that this is at the core of the decision-making processes and the research that we're talking about here. And I think that we have, at the same time, a very daunting challenge to get over some of the results that we see in terms of the catastrophe on climate, the catastrophe in terms of food systems, rising conflicts. And at the same time, we do have to look at the capacities and the new technology that is going to enable us to shape new solutions going forward, a new reality. As Advit mentioned it so nicely earlier on, it's a new phase for the development architecture and for the way that we are going to manage multilateralism going forward in a more united front. And I think that technology is going to help us to do that. We'll have to overcome the hurdles and learn and keep learning. But I think we have a lot of potential going forward. And IFAD is definitely driving the way when it comes to how this relates to our capacity to further rural development, taking our populations into consideration within that. So this has been extremely interesting, and I'll leave it to Advit for the last few words.
Yeah, not much to add to that, brilliant conclusion, Helen. So just to say, very excited to be working on some of these solutions. I would love to hear from many of you. If you'd like to reach out to us, we want to hear and find maybe we can adjust and improve. But yeah, no, this is all about the beneficiaries. And I think we have a moment here to use technology in a way that can completely change the game and how we can deliver aid. So thank you so much. And thank you, Helen and Dana.
Thank you both. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. A quick reminder that you can join us in September for Innovation Talks 11 and 12. And we'll be sharing links in the chat box. We want to thank our speakers and the team behind the scenes, Carmela and John. And I know we went over a minute on time, but it was a fascinating discussion. We're really pleased that everyone could attend today, and we're wishing you all a happy summer, and we'll see you in